Hey everyone, and welcome to what might just be the oddest trip through American folklore I've ever put together. Today we're taking a deep look into the Bluegrass state. And trust me when I say that Kentucky has some of the weirdest, creepiest, and most truly baffling tales in the whole country. We're talking about alien attacks that went on for hours, families born with blue skin, a goat man who tricks people into getting killed by trains, and yes, a day when chunks of meat actually fell from the sky. Before we jump in, I'd really like to know something. If you're in the USA, what state are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Maybe you're actually in Kentucky and get to experience these strange things firsthand. I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. This video is meant to be your companion for the next hour. Something you can kick back to, listen to while you work, or even doze off to as we make our way through Kentucky's weirdest tales. So, get cozy, settle in, and let's jump into some truly odd folklore together. Chapter 1. The Kelly Hopkinsville Encounter. Let's start off with what could be one of the most well-documented and honestly terrifying claimed alien encounters in American history. And I say claimed because, well, we'll get into that. But either way, what went down on the night of August 21st, 1955, near the small towns of Kelly and Hopkinsville is the kind of thing nightmares are made of. Picture this. You're at a farmhouse with your family on a warm summer evening. Nothing out of the ordinary, just another night in rural Christian County. Then out of nowhere, you're under attack for almost 4 hours by small metal creatures that seem totally unharmed by gunfire. Sounds like a horror flick, right? Well, that's exactly what the Sudden and Taylor families claimed went down. It all started around 7:00 p.m., when Billy Ray Taylor went out to the backyard well to grab some water. He came running back inside, saying he'd seen a shiny object fly through the air and touch down in a nearby ditch. Now, the family didn't really pay Billy Ray much mind at first. They probably figured he was imagining things or pulling their leg. But about an hour later, things got very real, very fast. The family dog started going completely crazy. And then Elmer Sutton and Billy Ray saw something coming toward the house. And let me tell you, the way these things were described is genuinely creepy. They stood about 3.5 feet tall with oversized heads that were almost perfectly round. Their arms were super long, nearly dragging on the ground and ended in what witnesses called claws. But the worst part, their eyes gave off a yellowish glow. Now, this being rural Kentucky in 1955, the two men did what any logical person would do when faced with unknown creatures approaching their home. They grabbed a 20-gauge shotgun and a .22 rifle and started firing. Based on their story, they hit at least one of these things at close range, and it literally flipped backward and scurried off into the dark. But here's where it gets really odd. The gunfire didn't seem to hurt them one bit. For the next 3 to 4 hours, these creatures kept showing up at windows, on the roof, at doorways. The family would shoot at them. The creatures would pull back, and then they'd come back again. The witnesses talked about hearing metallic sounds when the bullets hit the creatures, almost like shooting at a tin can. One family member later said they moved in a strange floating way, almost like they were swimming through the air. Now, you have to picture the scene inside that farmhouse. There were 12 people total, 5 grown-ups and 7 kids, all crammed together in fear while these things kept popping up and disappearing around the property. The adults took turns keeping watch, guns ready, while the children were scared out of their minds. Finally, around 11 p.m. the family had reached their limit. They piled into their cars and raced to the Hopkinsville police station. When they got there, they were in full-blown panic mode. The police took one look at these terrified people and decided this wasn't some joke. Chief Russell Greenwell, along with 4 city police officers, 5 state troopers, 3 deputy sheriffs, and 4 military police from nearby Fort Campbell, all headed to the Sutton farm. What they found when they arrived was interesting. No aliens, no spaceship, but plenty of signs that something had gone down. The house was full of bullet holes. The family was genuinely shaken. And interestingly, some of the officers said they saw strange lights in the sky that night, though they never found the creatures themselves. Here's where the story gets even more complicated. Project Blue Book, the U.S. Air Force's official UFO investigation program, labeled this case a hoax, just completely brushed it off. But here's the thing, if it was a hoax, it was the most over-the-top and pointless hoax ever. These people gained nothing from their story. In fact, their lives got a whole lot worse. They were made fun of, bothered, and had nosy people showing up at their farm all the time. The family members stuck to their story for decades. All 7 adults gave matching accounts with no conflicting details. When investigators talked to them a year later, their stories hadn't changed. Even years later, on their deathbeds, they kept saying they saw what they saw. So, what really happened? Well, there are a few ideas. The most common skeptical explanation is that the family ran into great horned owls. These birds are active at night, have big shiny eyes, can be pushy when protecting their turf, and when seen in the dark, could maybe look human-like in how they move. It's not the worst explanation, but it asks you to believe that a farming family in Kentucky couldn't tell the difference between owls and alien creatures, even up close, for 4 hours. Another idea suggests the whole thing was caused by too much moonshine. At least one sheriff who wasn't at the original scene said years later that everyone was drunk and someone was throwing a cat at a screen door to scare people. But this explanation doesn't account for the multiple sober witnesses or the genuine fear the police saw. The wildest idea is that it really happened. That for reasons we don't grasp, the Sutton family was visited by beings from somewhere else on that August night. The creatures have since been called the Hopkinsville Goblins, and they become a part of American UFO history. What makes this case stand out is its unique spot in history. It happened just 3 days after pilot Kenneth Arnold's famous flying saucer sighting near Mount Rainier and about 2 weeks before the Roswell incident in New Mexico. The summer of 1955 was in many ways the summer that kicked off modern UFO culture in America, and the Hopkinsville Goblins gave us the term and image of little green men, even though the witnesses never actually said they were green. The impact of this event is huge. Steven Spielberg originally wanted to base a horror movie on it called Night Skies before he switched gears to make E.T. instead. The 1986 movie Critters was loosely based on the encounter. Even the PM in Sabali was designed based on descriptions of the Hopkinsville Goblins. Today, Hopkinsville celebrates the encounter every year with events and festivals. They've embraced their art history, and honestly, good for them. Whether you think the family met aliens, owls, or something else entirely, you can't deny that something deeply strange happened on that farm in 1955, and 70 years later, we're still talking about it. Still trying to figure out what those people really saw on that terrifying August night. Chapter 2. The Blue People of Troublesome Creek. Alright, now we're going to switch from the otherworldly to the completely down-to-earth, but just as odd. This is a story that reads like fiction, like something out of a fantasy novel or a comic book. But I promise you, this is totally real, totally documented, and absolutely fascinating from both a genetic and a human angle. In the far-off hills of eastern Kentucky, specifically around Troublesome Creek and Ball Creek in the Appalachian Mountains, there lived a family whose skin was the color of a clear blue sky. Not a little bluish, not a hint, but genuinely deeply blue. Blue like Lake Louise, blue like a bruised plum. And this wasn't just one person with some strange condition. This was generations of a family covering nearly 200 years. The story starts in 1820 with a French orphan named Martin Fugate. Martin got a land grant on the banks of Troublesome Creek in what is now Perry County. Now, according to family stories, Martin himself may have been blue, though there's no official record of this. What we do know is that he married a woman named Elizabeth Smith, who was described as pale as the mountain laurel that blooms around the creek hollows each spring. Neither Martin nor Elizabeth showed any signs of unusual skin color. They seemed like a perfectly normal couple, settling into life in the remote Kentucky wilderness. Then they had children, 7 of them, and 4 of those children were born bright blue. Imagine the shock and confusion. This was 1820 in rural Appalachia. There were no doctors nearby, no medical books to check, no internet to search. Why is my baby blue? The parents had no idea what had happened or why, but the children were otherwise healthy, so they raised them like any other kids. Here's where genetics gets interesting. What neither Martin nor Elizabeth knew was that they both carried an incredibly rare recessive gene that causes a condition called methylglobinemia. The odds of 2 unrelated people meeting, falling in love, and both carrying this specific gene are astronomical. It's like winning the worst lottery imaginable. Methylglobinemia is a blood disorder where the body has too much methoglobin, a form of hemoglobin that doesn't carry oxygen properly. Normal people have less than 1% methoglobin in their blood. When the levels reach 10 to 20%, the skin takes on a blue color. But here's the thing, at these levels, most people don't have any other symptoms. They're perfectly healthy. They just happen to be blue. Now, in a normal mixed population, this gene would have died out or stayed extremely rare. But Troublesome Creek wasn't a normal mixed population. This was one of the most cut-off places in America. There were no roads. The railroad wouldn't reach the area until 1910. The only families nearby were related to Elizabeth through her side of the family. So, what happened? The Fugates began marrying each other and with a few other families in the area, many of whom were also related. One of Martin and Elizabeth's blue sons, Zachariah, married his mother's sister, his own aunt. Their kids kept marrying within the family, making that blue gene stronger and stronger with each generation. One descendant later said, and I'm quoting here, "I'm kin to myself." That's how tangled these family trees became. The Fugates became known locally as the Blue People of Kentucky or the Blue Fugates of Troublesome Creek. According to locals, they looked like anybody else except they had the blue color. Most of them lived normal lives, got married, had jobs, raised families. Many of them lived into their 80s and 90s with no health problems tied to their blue skin. The bluest of them all was Luna Stacy, who had 13 children and lived to age 77. But while physically they were fine, mentally and socially, it was a different story. Imagine being blue in a world that's mostly shades of white to black. The Puget-faced mockery, superstition, and social isolation. Some people in the area thought their condition was the work of the devil. Others had racist ideas about what caused it. The blue coloring made them targets of gossip and cruelty, which only made their isolation and continued inbreeding worse. The mystery of what caused the blue skin wasn't solved until the 1960s when a blood doctor named Dr. Madison Kane from the University of Kentucky heard whispers about blue people living in the mountains. Cain, who once said that blood cells always looked beautiful to him, was intrigued. He tracked down the Fugates and began studying them. While working at a heart clinic in Hazard, Cain met two blue siblings, Rachel and Patrick Ritchie. Through them and deep family history research, he pieced together the family tree and identified the cause, methylglobamia, caused by a lack of an enzyme called NADH cytochrome B5 reductase. He even came up with a treatment, a simple methylene blue pill that could be taken once a day to put the pink back in their cheeks. By the time Dr. Cain made his discovery, the condition was already becoming rarer, as roads and railroads finally connected Troublesome Creek to the rest of the world. Young people started leaving the area and marrying outsiders. With each generation that married outside the Fugate line, the chance of having blue children dropped dramatically since the gene is recessive. The last known blue Fugate was Benjamin Stacy, born in 1975 at the University of Kentucky Medical Center. When Benji was born, he was dark blue, almost purple. The color shocked the doctors so much they wanted to do an immediate blood transfusion. But Benji's grandmother spoke up and said, "Have you ever heard of the blue Fugates of Troublesome Creek?" His great-great-great-grandmother had been Luna Fugate, one of the bluest of them all. Benji's blue color faded as he grew up. He went on to attend Eastern Kentucky University, got married, and now lives a normal life in Alaska. Though apparently when he gets cold or angry, his lips and fingernails still turn blue. The story of the blue Fugates teaches us some important lessons. It's a reminder of how genetic isolation can boost rare traits. It's a case study in how geography and lack of connections can shape genetics. It shows us how people can be treated as outsiders and shunned for something completely beyond their control. The famous paintings you might see of the blue Fugates aren't based on actual photographs. By the way, they were made-up images created by an artist. The family didn't exactly sit for portraits. Today, the blue Fugates are remembered as a unique part of Kentucky history and a fascinating genetic case study. Books have been written about them, though many are made-up versions. The truth, as always, is stranger and more interesting than any fiction could be. Chapter 3. The Popelik Monster. From genetic oddities to something far more sinister and honestly dangerous. Let's talk about the Popelik Monster. This is a legend that has actually killed people. And unlike some folklore that's just spooky fun, this one comes with a very real and very sad death count. About 20 minutes east of downtown Louisville, just off Taylorsville Road near the community of Fisherville, there's a railroad bridge that crosses over Popelik Creek. The bridge was built in the late 1800s and rises 90 feet above the creek below, stretching 772 feet across. It's still an active railroad line owned by Norfolk Southern Railway, and according to local legend, it's home to a terrifying creature, part man, part goat, or part sheep, depending on who's telling the story. The Popelik Monster, also called the Goat Man, is described as standing upright like a human, but covered in fur with horns sticking out from its head and cloven hooves instead of feet. But it's not just the creature's looks that make it scary. According to the legend, the monster has supernatural powers. It can hypnotize people or use a voice that sounds like someone you trust to trick victims onto the bridge. And once you're up there 90 feet in the air on a narrow bridge with no railings and nowhere to hide, that's when you hear the train coming. The origin story of the Popelik Monster varies. Some say it's the result of a farmer who sacrificed goats to Satan in exchange for living forever. Others claim it's the product of, and I'm being serious here, a relationship between a human and a goat. But the most popular and detailed origin involves a circus. According to this version, there was a mean circus owner who kept the goat man as a freak show attraction, torturing and using the creature for profit. One night, during a violent thunderstorm, the circus train derailed near the bridge. Most of the crew died instantly, but the goat man survived, finally free. After years of being locked up and mistreated, it took its revenge on the survivors, ripping them apart. The circus owner's body was never found. Ever since then, the goat man has supposedly lived under or near the bridge, waiting for trespassers to take its revenge on humanity. Now, here's where this story goes from folklore to tragedy. The bridge is real, it's dangerous, and people have died on it. The legend has drawn countless people, mostly teens and young adults, to try crossing the bridge. Some are looking for the monster, some are just after thrills, and some are trying to prove their courage to friends. Whatever their reasons, the results have been devastating. There have been multiple confirmed deaths on the Popelik Bridge. People have been hit by trains, fallen from the bridge, or gotten stuck with nowhere to go when a train came around the bend. In 1987 and 1988 alone, 2 confirmed deaths were blamed on people being on the bridge. More recently, in 2016, a young woman from Ohio was killed by a train while on the bridge. The deaths and injuries continued despite fencing warning signs and the fact that being on the bridge is against the law and can lead to arrest. The legend really blew up in 1988 when a Louisville filmmaker named Ron Shieldneck made a 16-minute independent film called The Legend of the Popelik Monster. The film was meant to be a coming-of-age story that explored the local folklore, something Shieldneck grew up with. But the movie showed a teenager barely escaping a train by hanging from the edge of the bridge, something that's physically impossible in real life. The film's premiere caused an absolute uproar. Parents were furious. Railroad officials were calling with legal threats. The local newspaper, the Courier Journal, ran articles with headlines like Trestle of Death. Everyone was scared that the movie would inspire more people to go to the bridge, and sadly they were probably right. Norfolk Southern Railway responded by putting up tall chain-link fences around the access points to the bridge and posting danger signs everywhere. Police stepped up patrols in the area, but determined legend seekers keep finding ways to get onto the bridge. A railroad official once said that Pope Lick is one of the only places he knows that has such a tempting angle to it where people actively want to trespass on dangerous railroad property. What's interesting is that versions of Goatman legends exist all over the country. There's the Goatman of Maryland, sightings in Texas, stories from all over. But the Pope Lake monster is the most famous, partly because of Schildenek's film and partly because of the media attention from the real deaths that have happened there. Some local historians trace parts of the legend back to a man named Ches McCartney, a colorful character known as the Goatman. McCartney was a real person who traveled around with a wagon pulled by goats, and he was known for telling tall tales. One of his stories involved a cursed graveyard hidden beyond the Pope Bridge where dead bodies would come back to life as monsters, half human and half beast. Some believe this might be an early version of the Goatman legend. The legend even inspired a play by Naomi Wallace, a Kentucky poet who won a MacArthur Genius Grant. Her play, The Trestle at Poplar Creek, has been staged all over the country. It's set during the Depression and features a scene where confused teenagers race across the bridge as they hear a train coming. The play is meant to be symbolic, exploring themes of teenage confusion and death, but it uses the very real danger of the bridge as its setting. Here's the hard truth about the Poplar monster. The real monster isn't some supernatural creature. It's the mix of an urban legend, teenage daring, and a truly dangerous piece of infrastructure that's still in active use. The monster is the way folklore can make people do incredibly risky things. It's the tragedy that happens when myth meets reality on a railroad bridge with no way out. Local officials and the families of people who've died on the bridge have begged people to stay away. The railroad police department actively patrols the area. Signs warn that trespassing can lead to arrest, but still, people come drawn by the legend, by the thrill, by the challenge of it. If you ever find yourself near Louisville and you're curious about the public monster, please look at the bridge from the ground at Poplar Park. That's as close as you should ever get. The Goatman isn't real, but the trains are, and they're deadly. Don't let a legend end your life or ruin your family. The Poplar monster has claimed enough victims already. Chapter 4. The Kentucky Meat Shower of 1876. Alright, let's switch from the dark and sad to the just plain odd. And I mean really genuinely, what the heck is going on? Weird because on March 3, 1876 in Bath County, it rained meat from the sky, fresh red meat from a totally clear blue sky. And yes, some people tasted it. The incident happened in the community of Olympian Springs near the town of Owingsville on the farm of a man named Alan Crouch. It was around 11 o'clock a.m. or noon on a Friday, and Alan's wife Rebecca was outside with their 10-year-old grandson, Alan Jr. Rebecca was getting ready to make soap, preparing to light a fire under a big cast-iron pot, when her grandson suddenly yelled, "Hey, Grandma, it's starting to snow." But it wasn't snow. When they looked up at the perfectly clear sky, they saw hundreds of red chunks falling through the air like bloody snowflakes. These pieces of what looked like fresh meat started hitting the ground with wet splats. The shower lasted about 2 minutes and covered an area roughly 100 yards long by 50 yards wide. It was like standing under a canopy of meat falling from above. The pieces varied in size. Most chunks were about 2 inches square, though at least one piece was reported to be 4 inches square, according to witnesses. When the meat first fell, it seemed to be perfectly fresh. Rebecca and her grandson watched in horror and confusion as their farmyard was literally covered with mystery meat. Word of this bizarre event spread quickly through the community. The next day, a neighbor named Harrison Gill visited the farm to check it out. He found bits of meat still stuck to fences and scattered all over the ground. The local Bath County News covered the story, and from there it got picked up by the New York Times on March 10, 1876, which is how this weird little incident in rural Kentucky became national news. Now, here's where things get even stranger. Two gentlemen, whose names weren't recorded, decided that the best way to look into this event was to taste the mysterious sky meat. Because apparently in 1876, the scientific method included putting unknown substances in your mouth. These brave or incredibly foolish souls tasted the meat and said that it seemed to be either mutton or venison, because nothing says good science like eating meat that fell from the sky for unknown reasons. Scientists and curious people collected samples, and all kinds of theories immediately started flying around. One scientist named Leopold Brandes, writing in Scientific American Supplement, suggested it might be noster-like mass when it gets wet, but that theory didn't really explain the whole chunks of meat situation. The most likely and now generally accepted explanation came from a Dr. L.D. Caspine, who studied a sample and then set it on fire, noting that it gave off a rancid mutton smell. He suggested that the meat shower was the result of what I can only describe as organized projectile vulture vomiting. Here's how this lovely process works. Turkey vultures are scavenger birds that feed on dead animals. They're nature's cleanup crew. But vultures have a unique defense mechanism. When they feel threatened or need to lighten their load to take off quickly, they vomit up whatever they've recently eaten. And when one vulture starts vomiting, apparently they all do. It's like a chain reaction of airborne throwing up. So the theory goes that a flock of vultures flying very high above the Crouch Farm all emptied their stomachs at the same time. The pieces of partly digested meat then scattered as they fell, spreading out over the area due to wind currents and the height they fell from. In that time, before anyone really understood this behavior, it would have looked exactly like meat raining from a clear sky. A professor at Transylvania University in Lexington named Kurt Gayhardt found an original preserved sample of the meat shower in 2004. He had it tested though by that point. It had been stored in formaldehyde, alcohol, and various other chemicals for so long that getting clear DNA results was impossible. Various reports over the years have identified the meat as horse, deer, lamb, bear, and even human. But the truth is, we'll probably never know for sure what animal it came from. What we do know from looking at some samples under a microscope is that the meat included lung tissue, muscle, and fat, which fits with the vulture theory since vultures eat the soft internal organs of carcasses first. Giard, being a scientist with a wonderfully odd sense of humor, actually had the flavor profile of the preserved meat sample tested and then hired a company to create jelly beans that tasted like the 148-year-old meat shower sample. Because when life gives you mystery meat from the sky, apparently you make candy out of it. Bath County has fully embraced this bizarre piece of their history. The Bath County History Museum features an exhibit about the meat shower, complete with the preserved sample that was returned from Transylvania University. They've held festivals celebrating the event with kids making paper vultures for flying contests and vendors selling paintings of meat falling from the sky. They are planning an even bigger celebration for the 150th anniversary in 2026, including a reenactment of the shower, which I'm assuming will not use real meat. Now, some doubters have suggested the whole thing might have been a hoax, possibly carried out by Rebecca Crouch herself. There's an interesting twist here. The year before the meat shower, Bath County had gone through major crop failures, and many farming families had to accept food donations to get through the winter. One newspaper reported rumors that Rebecca wanted to sell the farm and leave Kentucky, though she denied this was the reason for any trickery. But here's the thing. If it was a hoax, it was seen by multiple people, covered by multiple newspapers, and samples were collected and kept. That's a lot of effort for a prank that got the family nothing but unwanted attention and mockery. The Kentucky meat shower remains one of the most bizarre and well-documented weird weather events in American history. And the truth is, whether it was vulture, vomit, a hoax, or something even stranger, the fact that chunks of meat fell from the sky onto a Kentucky farm on a clear March day in 1876 is documented and can't be denied. Sometimes reality is just genuinely unexplainably weird. Chapter 5. Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Alright, let's shift gears from the unexplained to something that's all too real, all too documented, and all too terrifying. We're heading to what many paranormal researchers considered the most haunted building in America. A massive crumbling hospital perched on a hill overlooking Louisville where death was so common, so expected that they built an entire tunnel just to secretly remove bodies so the living patients wouldn't lose hope. Welcome to Waverly Hills Sanatorium. The story starts in the early 1900s when Jefferson County was being absolutely destroyed by tuberculosis. They called it the White Plague or the White Death, and it was killing people by the thousands. Now, tuberculosis is a bacterial infection that mainly attacks the lungs. You catch it through the air when someone infected coughs or sneezes. And in the early 20th century, before antibiotics, it was basically a death sentence. Louisville was hit especially hard because the city was built on low, swampy land along the Ohio River, the perfect breeding ground for the tuberculosis bacteria. People were dying in huge numbers, and the disease was so contagious that the only answer was isolation, quarantine, get the sick people away from the healthy ones and hope for the best. In 1910, they opened a small two-story wooden hospital on Waverly Hill, a windy hill in southern Jefferson County. The name came from the school teacher who had worked there years earlier, Lizzie Lee Harris, who loved the Waverly novels by Sir Walter Scott. The original building could hold 40 to 50 patients in open-air rooms, the fresh air and rest being pretty much the only treatment available at the time. But tuberculosis kept spreading and that small building wasn't nearly enough. So in 1924, they started building something much, much bigger. The new Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened in 1926 and it was huge. A 5-story Gothic revival building that could hold 400 patients. It was considered the most advanced tuberculosis treatment facility in the country. It had its own power plant, water treatment facility, even a butcher shop and farm. It was designed to be almost completely suspicious. But here's the grim reality. Even with all that advanced care, most people who came to Waverly Hills never left. There was no cure for tuberculosis. The treatments they did try were barbaric by today's standards. They would collapse one of your lungs to let it rest. They would remove ribs to compress the lungs. They would do artificial pneumothorax, basically deflating your lung with a needle. Patients were forced outside in all weather conditions, even winter, because fresh air was thought to help. The death count at Waverly Hills was staggering. Now, you'll hear wildly different numbers depending on where you look. Some sources claim 63,000 people died there, but that's almost certainly an exaggeration. More careful and probably more accurate estimates put the number around 6,000 to 8,000 deaths over the facility's 51 years of operation. The highest death toll in a single year was 152, but even that careful estimate is huge. That's one person dying at Waverly Hills every 2 to 3 days for decades. The patients at Waverly Hills knew they were probably going to die there. Imagine being sent to this massive building on a hill, cut off from your family, knowing that most people who go in never come out. The mental toll must have been crushing. They try to keep spirits up with activities and events, but it's hard to stay hopeful when people around you are constantly dying. And this is where the death tunnel comes in. Hospital managers had a problem. Death was happening so often that moving bodies through the main building was destroying patient morale. So, they came up with an answer. There was already a supply tunnel that had been built to move materials from the bottom of the hill up to the hospital. It was 525 feet long, ran underground, and had a rail system. They started using it to transport the dead. The bodies would be moved through the tunnels at night, loaded onto the rail system, and taken down to waiting hearses at the bottom of the hill. Out of sight, out of mind. The living patients never had to see the endless line of death. The tunnel became known as the body chute, or the death tunnel. Nothing that went down that tunnel ever came back up. By 1943, things started to change. A PhD student named Albert Schatz discovered streptoicin, an antibiotic that could actually treat tuberculosis. For the first time in history, people had a real chance. By the 1950s, tuberculosis deaths had dropped sharply and Waverly Hills was no longer needed for its original purpose. It closed as a tuberculosis hospital in 1961, but the story doesn't end there. In 1962, it reopened as Woodhaven Geriatric Sanatorium, a home for the elderly, and this is where things get even darker. Budget cuts in the 1960s and 1970s led to terrible conditions. There are documented cases of patient abuse and mistreatment. Electroshock therapy was widely used. Some of the horror stories from the Woodhaven era are nightmares. The state finally shut it down in 1982. Since then, Waverly Hills has stood empty, slowly falling apart, and that's when the ghost stories really took off. People claim the building is deeply haunted, and given its history, it's not hard to see why. If any place should be haunted, it's a building where thousands of people died in fear, pain, and isolation. The most famous ghost is supposedly a boy named Timmy, a child who either lived in the children's area or died falling from the roof, depending on which version you hear. People bring balls for Timmy to play with, and some claim the balls roll back to them on their own. Then there's room 52 on the 5th floor. According to legend, a nurse hanged herself there in 1928 after finding out she was pregnant and unmarried. Another nurse supposedly jumped from the roof of room 502 in 1932. The room is reportedly one of the most active paranormal spots in the building. People report cold spots, voices with no source, a feeling of deep sadness. The death tunnel itself is supposedly crawling with paranormal activity, shadow figures, strange lights, the feeling of being watched or followed. Some investigators say they've heard moaning, felt hands touching them in the dark, seen full-body apparitions of patients who died decades ago. Now, I'm not here to tell you whether ghosts are real or not. That's for you to decide. But what is beyond question is the real horror that took place at Waverly Hills. Real people suffered and died there. Real families were broken apart by disease. Real medical staff watched helplessly as patients got worse despite their best efforts. Waverly Hills has been featured on countless paranormal TV shows, from Ghost Hunters to Ghost Adventures to BuzzFeed Unsolved. It's become a must-visit spot for paranormal fans from all over the world. The current owners, who bought the property in 2001, run ghost tours and investigations, and the place books up months in advance. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, Waverly Hills Sanatorium stands as a monument to one of the darkest periods in American medical history. It's a reminder of a time when a disease we can now easily treat with antibiotics was a sure death sentence. It's a memorial to the thousands who suffered and died within its walls, cut off from their loved ones, holding on to hope in a place where hope was in desperately short supply. The building itself is protected as a historical site now. They're slowly fixing it up, trying to save what's left. And maybe that's fitting because the stories of Waverly Hills, the real documented tragedies that happened there, deserve to be remembered. Ghost or no ghost, Waverly Hills is haunted by history, by loss, by the countless lives cut short by the White Plague. Chapter 6, The Beast of Land Between the Lakes. Now, let's head to Western Kentucky near the Tennessee border to a place where something allegedly happened in the early 1980s. That's so disturbing, so violent that many believe officials covered it up to protect tourism. This is the story of the Beast of Land Between the Lakes and the brutal murders that may or may not have happened there. Land Between the Lakes is a national recreation area covering about 170,000 acres between Kentucky Lake and Lake Barkley. It's beautiful, it's remote, and according to local legend, it's home to a 7-foot-tall creature that's part man, part wolf. capable of tearing human beings apart with its bare claws. The creature is variously called the Beast of LBL, the Dogman, or the Kentucky Werewolf. Unlike Bigfoot, which is described as more ape-like, the Dogman supposedly stands upright like a human, but has the head and features of a wolf. Witnesses describe it as very muscular but lean, with long arms ending in claws, glowing red eyes, and a terrifying look. Oh, and it reportedly smells absolutely terrible. Sightings of the creature go back to the 1960s, shortly after the land between the lakes was set up. But the legend really took off in the early 1980s when a story started going around about a family that was brutally murdered while camping in the area. According to the most widely shared version, around 3:00 a.m. one night in the early 1980s, two police officers pulled into a gas station near the LBL. They were regular customers, but this night was different. One of the officers collapsed on the curb and threw up. Both men were visibly shaken, traumatized by something they'd just seen. The gas station worker, a woman named Jan Thompson, came out to see what was wrong. What the officers told her was like a nightmare. They'd been called to a campsite deep in the LBL, where a family had been camping in a motorhome. When they got to the scene, they found a blood-soaked horror. The bodies of a mother, father, and young son had been torn apart, not stabbed, not shot, torn apart by something with teeth and claws. The coroner who looked at the bodies reportedly said the wounds were not from a bear, not from a mountain lion, not from any known animal in the area. The bite marks showed jaws far too large, with a snout much longer than any bear. There were 4 clear claw marks on one of the bodies, and the claws were estimated to be at least 2 in long. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. According to the story, the family's young daughter was found half stuck in a tree near the campsite. Dark brown or grayish fur was found held in the hands of one victim as if they'd fought back against their attacker. And then nothing. The story goes that officials covered the whole thing up. No news reports, no official investigation, no public admission that had it ever happened. Why? To protect the tourism industry in a struggling region. The last thing local businesses needed was people being scared to visit the land between the lakes. Now, here's the problem. There's absolutely no record that this event ever happened. No police reports, no death certificates, no newspaper articles. Doubters point out that there actually were some real murders in the LBL area around 1980, but they were clearly human-on-human crimes, not animal attacks. Some think the legend came from people mixing up different events or misremembering details, but believers argue that the lack of records is exactly what you'd expect from a cover-up, and there are people who claim to have inside knowledge. A man using the fake name Glenn gave a deathbed confession where he described finding the torn-apart family and being warned by officials never to talk about it. Jeanette Thompson, Jan's mother, claimed to have spoken directly to the officers who looked into the scene. Beyond this main incident, there are many other reported sightings of the beast. In 1973, a group of Murray State University students camping in the LBL said they had a terrifying run-in with the creature. Hunters report feeling followed in the woods, hearing unnatural howls and screams. Deep holes that look like nests are sometimes found dug in the woods with tufts of coarse grayish-brown fur inside them. In more recent years, sightings keep happening. In 2017, a witness on Labor Day reported hearing howling and seeing a large creature about 7 feet tall and stocky chase deer into the woods. Multiple people claim to have seen the beast near an abandoned structure known as Hotel California. The historical background makes the legend even more unsettling. The land between the lakes was created in the 1960s by the Tennessee Valley Authority, which dammed 2 rivers and flooded the area. Over 700 families were forced to move. Cemeteries were covered by water. Generations of people were pushed off land they lived on for over 200 years. Some local stories suggest that the making of the LBL woke up or let loose something that had been trapped or sleeping. There are also old tales from Native American legends about similar creatures and stories from early American settlers, about hunters disappearing in the woods and finding torn-up bison bodies with their throats ripped open by huge claws. Even now, rangers sometimes report bison calves going missing, and when it happens, the herd reportedly stays scared for days. So, what's the truth? Well, let's be honest. The lack of any official record of the 1980s murders is a pretty big warning sign. If a family was brutally killed in a national recreation area, there would be records. It's not the kind of thing you can just make vanish no matter how much you want to protect tourism. The most likely explanation for the main legend is that it's exactly that, a legend possibly based on a seed of truth, maybe inspired by real murders that were then added to and changed into something supernatural. Stories told around campfires growing and shifting with each telling until they become modern folklore. As for the creature itself, sightings of wolf-like creatures that walk on 2 legs have been reported all over the United States. The Michigan Dogman is probably the most famous. These could be mistakes where people see bears standing on hind legs, large wolves, or even people in costumes. Or they could be mass hysteria and the power of suggestion, people seeing what they expect to see in a dark forest. But here's what I will say. The land between the lakes is genuinely remote. There are huge areas of wilderness where you can be totally alone. At night, the woods can be absolutely terrifying, especially if you're already ready to be scared. Strange sounds carry in odd ways. Shadows play tricks, And if you're expecting to see a monster, your brain might just create one. Whether the beast of land between the lakes is real or not, the legend serves a purpose. It's a warning story about respecting the wilderness, about the dangers of going too deep into remote areas alone. It's a story about the unknown, lurking in the darkness just beyond the firelight. And maybe that's what folklore has always been about, not literal truth, but psychological truth, the things that scare us, the respect we should have for nature, the acknowledgement that there are still places in this world where humans aren't necessarily at the top of the food chain, even if that's just in our imaginations. Chapter 7. The Witch's Tree of Louisville. Now, let's head to Old Louisville, one of the largest Victorian preservation districts in the country, where a twisted, gnarled tree stands draped in beads, trinkets, and gifts. This is the Witch's Tree, and according to legend, it's the reason Louisville was once hit by one of the most powerful tornadoes in the city's history. The story starts in the late 1800s. At the corner of 6th Street and Park Avenue stood a tall maple tree. According to local legend, this wasn't just any tree, it was the favorite meeting spot for witches and voodoo practitioners, who would gather there nightly under the cover of moonlight to cast spells, brew potions, and do their rituals. For years, this arrangement worked fine. The witches had their tree, and everyone else stayed away. But in 1889, the city's May Day Festival Committee had big plans. They wanted to put up a maple for the yearly celebration, and they had their eyes on that beautiful maple tree. The witches, understandably, were not happy about this. They warned city officials against cutting down their sacred meeting place, but the committee didn't listen. After all, this was the Victorian era, a time of progress and new ideas. Beliefs about witches were considered old-fashioned at best, so one day workers came with axes and saws. The tree came crashing down and the witches fled to the west side of town where there was still forest. But before they left, the head witch reportedly stood at the stump and spoke a curse. She shouted, "Beware, Louisville, beware the 11th month." The city used the wood from the maple tree to build their maple and held their May Day celebration. Life went on as normal. People probably laughed about the witch's curse. 11 months seemed like a long time. Maybe everyone would just forget about it. But on March 27, 1890, exactly 11 months to the day after the tree was cut down, the witches made good on their promise. A huge tornado, later described as an F4 on the modern scale, tore through downtown Louisville. It was one of the most powerful tornadoes in Cayce's history. The storm became known as the Storm Demon. The tornado ripped through the city with devastating force. It destroyed hundreds of buildings, mansions, churches, schools, bourbon and tobacco warehouses, the railroad station. The destruction was catastrophic. Over 100 people lost their lives, including, according to some versions of the legend, members of the May Day Planning Committee who had ordered the tree cut down. But here's where the story gets really strange. As a tornado moved through the neighborhood, witnesses reported seeing a bolt of lightning shoot out of the twister itself and hit the stump where the old maple tree had stood. There was an explosion, a shower of sparks, flames, and smoke, and from that lightning-struck stump, a new tree began to grow. This wasn't a healthy, normal tree, though. The tree that grew from the stump was twisted, gnarled, covered with huge bumps, its branches reaching in all directions like something out of a nightmare. This is the tree that stands there today, looking otherworldly and strange, as if nature itself had been bent by the witch's curse. The witches, according to the legend, returned to this new tree, and this time the city of Louisville learned its lesson. Nobody touched the witch's tree. Nobody tried to cut it down. It was left to stand as a reminder of what happens when you anger forces you don't understand. Today, the witch's tree is a popular spot in Old Louisville. Visitors from all over come to see it and leave gifts to please the witches. The tree is absolutely covered with Mardi Gras beads, tarot cards, candles, skeleton keys, horseshoes, crosses, crystals, and all kinds of trinkets and small items. It looks like a bizarre Christmas tree decorated by people who practice the occult. There's a specific tradition tied to leaving gifts. The higher up in the branches you can throw your beads or trinkets, the better your luck will be. People spend a good amount of time trying to get their gifts as high as possible. The tree has its own Facebook page where people who leave gifts are sometimes thanked by messages supposedly from the witches themselves. But there's also a very serious warning. If you take anything from the tree, if you steal someone else's gift or remove any of the decorations, you risk bringing the witch's curse down on yourself. Multiple people have reported bad luck, accidents, and misfortune after taking items from the tree. The general rule is simple. Leave gifts, don't take them. The tree has become such a part of Louisville culture that it's a regular stop on ghost tours and historic tours of Old Louisville. The neighborhood itself is known as America's most haunted neighborhood due to the large number of paranormal legends and reported hauntings in the Victorian mansions that lined the streets. Now, let's talk about the reality behind the legend. There really was a devastating tornado that hit Louisville on March 27, 1890. It killed between 76 and 100 people, depending on which records you check, injured around 200 more and caused massive destruction throughout the city. This is documented historical fact. Whether there was actually a maple tree at that spot that was cut down for May Day celebrations in 1889, whether witches actually gathered there, whether the head witch cursed the city, That's where history blurs into legend. But the story sticks because it gives a story-based reason for a terrible tragedy. The tree that stands there now is genuinely old, genuinely strange-looking, and does seem to have grown in an unusual twisted way. Whether it grew from a lightning-struck stump or just happened to grow that way naturally, we can't say for sure. What's interesting is how the legend has grown into a living tradition. Modern followers of Wicca and other pagan traditions do visit the tree and leave gifts. The tree has become a real focus point for people interested in witchcraft, the occult, and alternative spirituality. In a way, whether or not witches gathered there in 1889, they certainly gathered there now. The legend also serves as a warning story about respecting things you don't understand and not dismissing beliefs just because they seem old or superstitious. Whether you believe in curses or not, the tornado was real, the destruction was real, and the tree stands as a reminder. If you ever visit Louisville and want to see the witch's tree, it's at the corner of 6th Street and Park Avenue in Old Louisville. Just remember it's right next to someone's private home. So, be respectful, leave a gift if you want. Take a photo, admire the twisted branches and the decades of trinkets that hang from them. But whatever you do, don't take anything from the tree. According to the legend, the witches are still watching and they have long memories. Chapter 8. Edgar Cayce, the Sleeping Prophet. From cursed trees to something completely different. Let's talk about one of Cayce's most famous and debated figures. Edgar Cayce, a man with only a 9th grade education, who became the most documented psychic of the 20th century, giving over 14,000 readings while in a trance state, predicting world wars, diagnosing illnesses, and becoming known worldwide as the Sleeping Prophet. Edgar Cayce was born on March 18, 1877 on a farm near Hopkinsville in Christian County. From the very beginning, he seemed different from other children. He wasn't interested in typical boyhood activities. He preferred reading the Bible, going to church, and spending time alone. By age 10, he had committed to reading the entire Bible cover to cover every single year. According to Cayce's own accounts, his psychic abilities showed up early. He claimed he could see and talk to his dead grandfather's spirit. He played with what adults thought were imaginary friends, but Cayce insisted were spirits from the other side. He said he could see right through these beings if he focused hard enough. When he was about 12 years old, Cayce had an experience that would shape his whole life. He was sitting by a creek reading his Bible when a woman with wings on her back appeared to him. She asked him what he wanted most in the world. He told her he wanted to help people, especially children. Then she disappeared. That same year, something remarkable happened that would show his unusual abilities. Cayce was having trouble with his schoolwork, specifically spelling. His father was testing him on spelling words and getting more and more frustrated because Edgar couldn't seem to remember anything. At one point, his father got so angry he knocked Edgar out of his chair. That night, tired and upset, Edgar fell asleep with his spelling book under his pillow. When he woke up the next morning, he knew every word in the book, not just how to spell them but their meanings, and he could even picture the exact page each word was on. He had taken in the whole book while sleeping. This became a pattern. Edgar could sleep on any book and wake up with perfect knowledge of what was in it. But having these abilities didn't make Cayce's life easier. In fact, it made things a lot more complicated. He struggled with whether these gifts were from God or from darker forces. He once asked his mother if his abilities meant he was doing the devil's work. She told him, "So long as you are right, son, they will be right. The devil cannot speak through a righteous man." As a young adult, Cayce's life took another turn. He was working as a salesman when he developed a paralysis of his vocal cords. He could only speak in a whisper. Doctors couldn't help him. Then a traveling hypnotist named Hart came through town and put Cayce under hypnosis. While hypnotized, Cayce could speak normally. But as soon as he woke up, his voice was gone again. A local man named Al Lane, who had some knowledge of hypnosis and osteopathy, had an idea. What if Cayce could diagnose his own condition while in a hypnotic state? On March 31, 1900, they tried it. Cayce was put into a trance, and while unconscious, he described his own medical condition. In technical terms, he shouldn't have known and prescribed a treatment. The treatment worked. His voice came back. This was the start of Cayce's career as a psychic diagnostician. Word spread that this man could diagnose illnesses while in a trance state. People started coming to him for help. The format was always the same. Cayce would lie down on a couch, loosen his tie and collar, and put himself into a self-hypnotic trance. Someone, usually his wife, Gertrude, would tell him the name and location of a patient. Cayce would then describe the person's medical condition and suggest treatments, all while completely unconscious. The remarkable thing is that over 8,000 of his 14,000 readings were medical in nature, and many of them involved people Cayce had never met, people who lived hundreds or thousands of miles away. He would describe their symptoms accurately and suggest treatments that often worked even though Cayce himself had no medical training. Dr. Wesley Ketchum, a medical doctor with a traditional background, used Cayce as an addition to his practice for several years. Hundreds of people spoke about the accuracy of Cayce's diagnosis. Now, we have to be careful here. These are personal accounts. We don't have strict scientific studies, but the sheer number of testimonials and the fact that medical doctors were willing to work with him suggests that something interesting was happening. What's fascinating is that Cayce's health advice from the 1920s, and 30s actually holds up pretty well by today's standards. He emphasized things like proper diet, exercise, and the mind-body connection. Decades before these became mainstream medical ideas, but Cayce's readings went beyond just medical diagnosis. Over time, he started giving what he called life readings, which explored reincarnation, past lives, and karma. He would tell people about their previous lives and how those past lives were affecting their current life. This was controversial, especially for a man who strongly identified as a Christian. The idea of reincarnation isn't part of traditional Christian teaching. Cayce also made predictions about world events. In 1935, he predicted how World War II would unfold, describing an alliance between Germany, Austria, and Japan. This was 5 years before the Tripartite Pact was signed. He predicted that the whole world would be set on fire by militaristic groups. He made other strange predictions too. He spoke at length about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essenes, the people who created them. This was in the 1930s and early 1940s. The Dead Sea Scrolls weren't found until 1947, 2 years after Cayce's death. He predicted the use of blood as a diagnostic tool, which is now standard practice. He described what we now know as El Niño and La Niña weather patterns. He saw the coming together of communication companies working together, which kind of sounds like the internet and modern telecommunications. Cayce also talked about a lost continent called Atlantis, and made various predictions about earth changes and geological shifts. These are the predictions that tend to get the most attention from believers and the most criticism from doubters. Throughout his life, Cayce struggled with his abilities. He didn't want to be seen as different or strange. He wanted a normal life. According to his biographer, he didn't want to be a psychic medium or a mystic healer, but people kept coming to him for help and he felt pushed to give readings. The readings took a physical toll. Cayce would be exhausted after each session, and as his fame grew, the demand for his services increased. He gave thousands of readings over 4 decades, often multiple readings per day. In 1931, Cayce started the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the R, in Virginia Beach, Virginia. The organization still exists today and keeps all of Cayce's readings in a database. They've documented and kept every single one of the 1,436 readings he gave during his lifetime. Edgar Cayce died on January 3, 1945 in Virginia Beach. He had suffered a stroke and was in failing health, possibly due to the exhaustion from giving so many readings, especially during World War II when desperate people flooded him with requests for help. So, what do we make of Edgar Cayce? Doubters point out that many of his predictions were vague, that some didn't come true, that personal medical stories aren't the same as controlled scientific studies. They note that he made claims about Atlantis and ancient civilizations that aren't backed by archaeological evidence. Believers point to the documented cases where his medical readings were accurate, where he diagnosed conditions that doctors had missed, where he suggested treatments that worked. They point to his predictions that did come true. They argued that the huge number and consistency of his readings over 4 decades suggests something genuinely unusual was happening. What's beyond question is that Edgar Cayce, a simple man from rural Kentucky with very little formal education, became one of the most famous psychics in American history. His readings are still studied today. The R has chapters in 25 countries. Books are still being written about him. Whether you think he was genuinely psychic, a gifted, intuitive, a fraud, or something in between, his impact on American culture and the New Age movement is major. And perhaps what's most interesting is Cayce himself, a devoted Christian who struggled with whether his gifts were divine or demonic. A man who wanted nothing more than to help people, but found that his abilities made him an outsider. In the end, he chose to use his gifts in service of others, giving thousands of readings over his lifetime, trying to heal, trying to help, trying to live up to that promise he made as a young boy. Sitting by a creek, reading his Bible to the woman with wings, who asked him what he wanted most. Chapter 9. The Bluegrass Conspiracy. Alright, let's switch gears dramatically from psychic prophets to something that sounds like it came straight out of a Hollywood thriller. The Bluegrass Conspiracy is a true crime saga involving elite Kentucky blue blood families, corrupt cops, international drug smuggling, weapons theft, Colombian cartels, and a man who literally fell from the sky wearing a parachute and carrying 77 pounds of cocaine. And yes, this story is what inspired the movie Cocaine Bear. This story centers around Andrew Carter Thornton Tabot. Everyone called him Drew, born in 1944 in Bourbon County. Drew came from old Kentucky money. His family owned a Maine stud farm in Lexington. He attended private schools, the Swanee Military Academy and the Idaho Country Club before transferring to St. Paul's Preparatory School. Drew was, by all accounts, a thrill-seeker. After graduating from Military Academy in 1962, he joined the Army and became a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division. He took part in the 1965 U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic and was wounded in battle, receiving a Purple Heart. So, he was a true war hero. After leaving the military, Drew joined the Lexington Police Department in 1968. He became part of the narcotics squad in the early 1970s and worked on drug investigations with the D while working as a cop. He also went to law school at the University of Kentucky, getting his law degree in 1976. So, Here's a guy who's a decorated veteran, a police officer, and a lawyer, pillar of the community. Right, wrong. While working as a narcotics officer, Drew Thornton was building a drug smuggling empire. He teamed up with his old friend from military school, Bradley Bryant, who had served in the Marines. Together with a man named Ralph Ross, who worked at high levels of the Kentucky state legislature, they formed what became known as the Company. This wasn't some small-time operation. This was the biggest drug smuggling ring in Kentucky history. Here's how it worked. Bryant leased small planes through a security company he owned called Executive Protection. Thornton, who had gotten his pilot's license and loved flying, would fly these planes to remote locations in South America, load up with marijuana and cocaine and fly back to small airports in Kentucky. He knew all the weak points of the police department because he had worked there. He knew when shifts changed, who was on duty, where the blind spots were. They would land right on the tarmac at Lexington Airport and unload drugs to dealers in broad daylight. The boldness is stunning. They were making hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of dollars, but it gets worse. The company also got involved in stealing military weapons from the China Lake Naval Weapons Center in California. They stole automatic weapons, high-grade military gear with the intent to trade these weapons to Colombian drug cartels in exchange for cocaine. About 25 men were eventually tied to these thefts. The operation ran smoothly for years. Thornton and Bryant were protected by their connections. Remember, Ross worked in the state legislature and had inside information about investigations. Multiple people involved in the company had law enforcement connections, including ties to the DEA. But things started to fall apart. In 1980, a hotel maid found a room filled with cash, weapons, and documents linking Bryant to drug trafficking. Bryant was arrested and eventually worked with investigators. Thornton was also arrested but served only 5 months in prison. Upon his release, he immediately went back to his drug smuggling contacts in South America. By 1985, the heat was really on. Federal authorities were closing in. Thornton planned one last major drug run to Colombia. On September 11, 1985, he flew a Cessna 4004 loaded with cocaine from Colombia, heading back to the United States. But law enforcement was onto him as he flew over the Chattahoochee National Forest in Georgia. With authorities closing in, Thornton made a desperate choice. He started throwing duffel bags of cocaine out of the plane to lighten his load. Then he set the plane on autopilot, strapped a final duffel bag containing 77 pounds of cocaine to his body, grabbed $4,800 in cash, some guns, including a 9mm handgun and a .22 caliber Derringer, multiple knives, night vision goggles, and 6 gold Krugerrand coins. Oh, and he was wearing a bulletproof vest and expensive Italian Gucci loafers. And then Drew Thornton jumped out of the plane. Something went horribly wrong with his parachute. His main chute was still in its pack. His reserve chute was only partly open. He was found the next morning by an 85-year-old man named Fred Myers, who looked out his bathroom window while shaving and saw a dead body in his driveway in Knoxville, Tennessee. The body was wearing fatigues, expensive shoes, and had a duffel bag strapped to it, containing what turned out to be $15 million worth of cocaine. Thornton's plane crashed over 60 miles away in North Carolina. It was found with more drugs on board. But here's where the cocaine bear part of the story comes in. Remember those duffel bags Thornton threw out of the plane? 3 months later, a dead black bear was found in the Chattahoochee National Forest. The medical examiner's report stated the bear had died from eating a huge amount of cocaine. According to the report, the bear was packed to the brim with cocaine. The bear had found the duffel bags Thornton had dumped, torn them open, and consumed enough cocaine to kill it several times over. The bear was stuffed and after a truly strange journey through various owners, eventually ended up at the Kentucky Fun Mall in Lexington, where you can see it today. The 2023 movie Cocaine Bear took this true story and turned it into a fictional horror comedy about what might have happened if the bear had gone on a violent rampage before dying. In reality, the bear just ate cocaine and died. But the movie brought renewed attention to the Bluegrass Conspiracy. Now the full scope of the Bluegrass Conspiracy goes far beyond just Drew Thornton. This involved dozens of people, possibly including judges, politicians, and law enforcement officials at multiple levels. There were mysterious deaths, unsolved murders, claims of cover-ups. It's a rabbit hole that goes deep. Sally Denton, an investigative journalist who worked for WKYT in Lexington in the early 1980s, was one of the first to reveal the extent of the corruption. She faced intense criticism and pushback. People didn't want to believe that cocaine cowboys existed within the Lexington Police Department, but Thornton's death in 1985 confirmed much of her reporting. She later wrote a book called The Bluegrass Conspiracy, an inside story of power, greed, drugs, and murder. The story has inspired not just the Cocaine Bear movie, but also documentaries, books, a stage musical, and countless articles. It remains one of the wildest true crime stories in Kentucky history. What makes it so gripping is the sheer boldness of it. These weren't street-level drug dealers. These were sons of Kentucky's elite, decorated veterans, police officers, lawyers, people with every advantage who chose to build a criminal empire. They weren't desperate, they were greedy. And the ending with Drew Thornton falling from the sky onto a driveway in Tennessee, wearing Gucci loafers and carrying millions in cocaine. It's so bizarre it would be rejected as made up if it were fiction, but it's true, all of it. The Bluegrass Conspiracy stands as a reminder that corruption and crime can exist at any level of society, that badges and law degrees don't automatically mean honesty, and that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happened. Chapter 10. The Mammoth Cave Wars and Floyd Collins. Let's end this journey through Cookie's weirdest folklore with a story that's sad, gripping, and ultimately became one of the first major media events of the radio age. This is the story of Floyd Collins, a cave explorer who became trapped underground in 1925 in the desperate, chaotic, ultimately doomed rescue attempt that held the entire nation spellbound for over 2 weeks. To understand Floyd Collins, you need to understand the Kentucky Cave Wars. In the early 20th century, cave tourism was big business in central Kentucky, especially around Mammoth Cave, which was already known as one of the longest cave systems in the world. Property owners who had caves on their land saw them as potential gold mines. You could charge admission, give tours, sell souvenirs, but there was intense competition. Cave owners used aggressive, often shady tactics to steal business from each other. They'd put up misleading signs directing tourists to their caves instead of competitors. They'd hire people to badmouth other caves. Some even went as far as damaging rival caves or blocking access routes. This cutthroat period became known as the Cave Wars, and it was in this setting that Floyd Collins tried to make his fortune. Floyd was born on July 20, 1887, on a farm near Mammoth Cave. He'd been exploring caves since he was 6 years old, originally looking for Native American artifacts to sell to tourists. In 1917, he discovered Great Crystal Cave on his family's property. It was beautiful, featuring unique gypsum flowers and spa formations. Floyd developed it into a tourist attraction. But there was a problem. Crystal Cave was located way down a back road, far past other competing show caves. Most tourists never made it that far. They'd see another cave first and stop there. Floyd was making almost no money. So Floyd had a plan. He would find or create a cave entrance closer to the main highway leading to Mammoth Cave. He made a deal with a neighbor named B. Doyle who owned property right along the main road. If Floyd could find or develop a good cave, they'd split the profits. Floyd started working on a small opening on Doyle's property that he hoped would lead to something amazing. He called it Sand Cave. On January 30, 1925, Floyd entered Sand Cave alone, carrying only a kerosene lamp. He'd been working on widening the passageways for weeks. The cave was challenging. At one point he had to squeeze through a passage so tight he had to go on his stomach with one arm stretched ahead, pushing his lamp and the other arm at his side. It was barely 9 in tall in places. Beyond that crawl, the cave opened up and Floyd believed he'd found a large grotto chamber. But as he was working that day, his lamp started to flicker and dim. Floyd knew the absolute terror of being in a cave with no light. So he started heading back out immediately. As he was crawling back through that tight passage, about 55 feet underground, and roughly 125 feet from the entrance, disaster struck. Floyd's foot dislodged a 27 lb rock which fell and pinned his ankle. He was stuck in a space so tight he could barely move. He couldn't get enough leverage to move the rock. He was trapped in what he later described as a stone straitjacket. When Floyd didn't return home that evening, his family grew worried. His brothers, Homer and Marshall, went to look for him. They found him trapped in that impossibly tight crowway. They tried to dig him out but couldn't make progress. The rock was wedged too tightly. Word spread quickly. Neighbors gathered at the cave entrance. Marshall offered $500, a fortune in 1925, to anyone who could free his brother. But the passageway was so tight that only the smallest people could even reach. Floyd, a 17-year-old boy named Jules Estes, was one of the few who could crawl back to talk to him. What happened next turned into a media circus. A young reporter from the Louisville Courier-Journal named William Skez Miller arrived at the scene. He was 21 years old and slight of build when Floyd's brother, Homer, snapped at him to find out the information himself if he wanted it. Miller, not wanting to back down, crawled into the cave. Miller's first-hand reporting changed the story from a local tragedy into a national sensation. He interviewed Floyd in that cramped, wet, cold crawlway and wrote vivid descriptions of the conditions. Miller wrote, "It is terrible inside. The cold, dirty water numbs us as soon as we're starting. We have come to dread it, but each of us tell ourselves that our suffering is as nothing compared to Collins." The story exploded. This was one of the first major news events broadcast on radio, which was still a new thing. In 1925, radio operators posted regular updates from the site. Miller's articles appeared in over 1,200 newspapers across the country. Silent film crews shot footage. Within days, thousands of people flocked to Cave City. Some were there to help. Most were just onlookers. The scene became chaotic. Reporters, photographers, vendors selling food and souvenirs, curious sightseers, all crowding around the cave entrance. Over 150 volunteers were trying to help dig Floyd out. But there was no organized leadership, no clear plan. People would volunteer to bring food and water to Floyd, but then get scared in the tight darkness and leave the supplies in cracks and crevices, never reaching him. Floyd was getting worse. He was cold, hungry, in pain, fading in and out of awareness. He kept saying to Homer, "Take me home to bed." To another rescuer he said, "I'm trapped for life." At one point, officials tried to reach him by digging straight down through the rock, but it was slow, dangerous work. Rumors started flying that the whole thing was a hoax, a publicity stunt to bring tourists to Crystal Cave. The stories got so out of hand that police ordered a grand jury investigation. The media began showing the rescue effort in a bad light, criticizing the disorganization and delays. On February 16, 1925, rescuers finally reached the chamber where Floyd was trapped. He had been underground for 17 days, but when they got there, he was already dead. Medical examiners figured he'd been dead for 3 to 5 days, likely from exposure, dehydration, and starvation. Floyd Collins's body was brought out 2 months later, but even in death, his story wasn't over. In 1927, Floyd's father, struggling financially after tourism in the area, dropped following Floyd's death, sold Crystal Cave to a dentist named Dr. Harry Thomas. Thomas did something awful. He put Floyd's body in a glass-topped coffin and displayed it inside Crystal Cave as a tourist attraction. In 1929, the body was stolen, later recovered minus one leg and kept in a chained casket in a remote part of the cave. In 1961, when Crystal Cave was bought by Mammoth Cave National Park, Floyd's body was still there. It wasn't until 1989, 64 years after his death, that Floyd Collins was finally given a proper burial at Mammoth Cave Baptist Church Cemetery. Floyd Collins's story earned reporter William Miller a Pulitzer Prize. It inspired songs, including The Death of Floyd Collins, which became a hit. It inspired books, documentaries, and a Broadway musical. The 1951 film Ace in the Hole, starring Kirk Douglas, was based on Floyd's story. The tragedy led to major changes. Congress, which had been talking about creating Mammoth Cave National Park, moved forward with the project, partly to prevent future disasters like Floyd's. The government realized that as locals kept searching for caves, more rescues would be needed. Floyd Collins is remembered today, not for the cave he hoped to profit from, but for the way he died. His story captured something about human nature, our fascination with disaster, the power of new media, the thin line between heroism and using others for gain. Thousands of people came to Sand Cave, some to help, many just to stare. Vendors sold refreshments. It was part rescue mission, part carnival, and through it all, Floyd Collins lay trapped in darkness, 55 feet underground, waiting for help that came too late. He went into that cave, chasing the American dream, trying to make something of himself, trying to escape the poverty of his situation. What he found instead was death, and ironically, the fame and attention he'd sought, but only after it was too late to do him any good. Floyd Collins is buried now at Mammoth Cave Baptist Church Cemetery. Visitors can pay their respects to the man who became in death far more famous than he ever was in life. The cave explorer whose 17-day ordeal underground captivated a nation and changed cave exploration forever. And there you have it, folks. 10 of the strangest, most fascinating and sometimes darker stories that Kentucky has to offer. From aliens to genetics, from curses to conspiracies, from psychic prophets to tragic cave explorers. Cayce's folklore is as rich and varied as any state in the nation. What strikes me about these stories is how they show different sides of human nature. Our fear of the unknown in stories like the Kelly Hopkinsville Encounter and the Beast of Land Between the Lakes. Our fascination with genetic mysteries like the Fugates. Our respect for forces we don't understand with the Witch's Tree. Our ability for both incredible greed and tragic bravery in stories like the Bluegrass Conspiracy and Floyd Collins. Some of these stories are probably true in most of their details, like the Blue Fugates and the meat shower. Some are likely false, but stick around because they serve a cultural purpose. Some fall somewhere in between, where truth and legend have become so mixed that telling them apart is impossible. But all of them are part of Cayce's identity, part of what makes the Bluegrass State unique. These are the stories people tell around campfires, the legends passed down through generations, the odd history that doesn't make it into standard textbooks, but that everyone who lives there knows about. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Kentucky folklore, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which story was your favorite. And if you're from Kentucky and have your own weird folklore to share, I'd love to hear it. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that sometimes the strangest stories are the ones that are actually true. Thanks for watching.